Hello and welcome to the next of our full course lectures. This lecture is looking at agency theory and transactional theory. So we're really still in our introductory phase to corporate governance, and we're bringing in some of the key areas that we need to consider when we look at corporate governance and corporate governance codes. So the first of these is agency theory. So agency theory revolves around the following concept. Agents, who are the management, act for the principals, who are the shareholders, to manage the company. So the principal is the shareholders, so they have the agents, who are the management, who manage the company on their behalf. That's all because of these joint stock companies that we talked about in the previous lecture. So what does that mean? Well, there are some important things. First of all, the interests of each of these are different. The agents will have different interests than the shareholders. What do each of them want? First of all, the shareholders. Well, the shareholders want long-term successful investments. Primarily what they want is protection of their capital. If you ask shareholders, do you want a good return on the share price every year and good dividends paid every year? Of course they will say yes. But if you say to them, is that as important as protecting your investment so that the business doesn't fail and you lose your capital? They will say, protect the capital. They want to make sure that they have a long-term, stable investment where they can have a return, yes, but make sure that their capital is protected. Managers, on the other hand, well, they are interested in pay and bonuses, and they want it now in the short term. So shareholders want long-term stability, managers want short-term pay, bonuses, they want to gain power as quickly as possible. Those two interests are not the same. So managers may well take risks in the organisation to get those short-term returns that shareholders would feel are inappropriate given their long-term investment requirements. So how do we get goal congruence? How do we make sure that managers and shareholders want the same thing? How do we make sure that the managers who are acting as agents of the shareholders, who are acting on behalf of the shareholders, are doing the correct thing for those shareholders? And that's really where corporate governance comes in. That's why we have corporate governance codes, to ensure that managers act in an appropriate way given this agency relationship between them and the shareholders. So some of the key terms you need to be aware of in this area. First of all, this agency relationship. Remember, the agency relationship is between the principal and the agent. So in our case, we're primarily looking at the relationship between the shareholders, who are the principal, and the agent, who are the management within an organisation. There will be agency costs. Those agency costs will be costs to the principal. So in this case, it would be costs incurred by the shareholders. And those costs are incurred when monitoring the agent. Because remember, you can't just trust the agent to do what's right for the principal. You need to monitor them. You need to make sure that they're doing the right thing. So there'll be a cost involved in that. So the cost will be to the principal, and that will be the cost of monitoring the agent who's acting on their behalf. The agency relationship is an example of a fiduciary relationship. So this is where the agent is responsible to the principal. So a fiduciary relationship means that you've got some responsibilities. And in this case, the agent is the one who's responsible. They're responsible to the principal. They answer to the principal and have a duty of care to that principal. And the key thing here is the differing objectives. There are differing objectives between the agent, who are the management, and the principal, who are the shareholders. Remember, the agent wants short-term money, bonuses, and power now. The principal wants a stable, long-term investment. Those are not the two same things. They are different. And we have to try and bring those two together. So it's not just the relationship between the shareholders and management. That's an example of agency relationships. There are others. So there's the relationship we've been discussing, the directors and the shareholders, where the directors manage the company and the shareholders own it. But there's also the relationship, for example, between the auditors and the shareholders. This is where the auditors report to the shareholders. They go in and they do tests on the financial statements of the organisation, and they then provide a report and opinion to the shareholders as to the truth and fairness of those financial statements. That again is an example of an agency relationship. The auditors are acting as the agents of the shareholders. So remember, I said that there are agency costs, and that's because monitoring those agents costs money. Where do those costs arise? Well, there'll be reporting costs. So for example, the auditor's report costs money. The incentive costs. So we have to make sure that we have incentives in place to try and get the agents to act in a way that's beneficial to the principal. For example, by offering share options or deferred bonuses or bonuses related to the share price. So those incentives cost money. Those are agency costs. There's also going to be the cost of risk taking. The agents are going to take risks. That will have a cost because when there's a risk, there's always that chance that it may go wrong. Also, don't forget there'll be directors' extras. So little things that the directors will get paid through the organisation. To company cars, for example. Little extra bits and pieces that the directors pay for out of company money. Remember, that's shareholders' money. Those directors' extras are a cost of that agency relationship. So how can we resolve this agency problem? How can we resolve the fact that the goals of management and the goals of the shareholders are not the same? Well, some of the actions we can take are regular meetings to make sure that shareholders are updated as to what's happening in the organisation and what actions their agents, the managers, are taking. We can then have shareholder votes on those different areas, particularly on directors' pay, and there is some talk now of actually making shareholders' votes on executive pay binding, so that you couldn't have a pay settlement that wasn't accepted by the shareholders. Shareholders, of course, could accept takeover bids, and that would oust the management that are currently in place. Or at the extreme end, the investors, the shareholders, could sell their shares. If they're not happy with the relationship between them and the management, if they don't feel that management are acting in their interests, of course they could sell their shares. The main way to resolve this is through corporate governance, and that's what we're going to be looking at in detail over the next few lectures. So corporate governance regulates the relationship between the shareholders and the agents, the management within the organisation. It seeks to create accountability. It seeks to make sure that directors have responsibilities whenever they perform their duties. So we're going to look in detail at some of those responsibilities over the next few lectures. Let's introduce ourselves to this now in illustration 1. So we've got a scenario in illustration 1. I want you to read through the scenario and maybe have a go at the first part of this illustration relating to the definition of agency. Then we're going to look at some of the corporate governance requirements that we're going to meet over the next few lectures. So this illustration will act as an introduction to some of the requirements that we'll see when it comes to directors' responsibilities. In illustration 1, we have a requirement that states to explain agency in the context of corporate governance and criticise the governance arrangements of Roche and Company. So I want to look at this one because first of all we've been looking at agency, so that will enable us to explain what agency is. And then I want to give you a little bit of an introduction as to the sorts of things that corporate governance will look at. So I don't expect you to know this as yet, but this will give you an idea as to what the requirements around the board are going to be. So first of all, looking at this definition of agency. A principal, remember, appoints an agent to act on his or her behalf. In the case of corporate governance, the principal is a shareholder in a joint stock company and the agents are the directors. So they have the agency relationship with the principals. So that's what we have here, a principal and an agent. The principal in this case will be the shareholders, the agent will be the managers. The directors remain accountable to the principals for the stewardship of their investment in the company. In the case of Roche, in our example, our illustration, 60% of the shares are owned by shareholders external to the Roche family, and the board has an agency responsibility to those shareholders. So, criticisms of the arrangements that they have for their corporate governance. So this will give you an idea of the sorts of requirements that the corporate governance codes will have. So there's 5 main areas we can make a point on here. First of all, several issues with the non-executive directors. It's doubtful whether 2 non-executive directors are enough to bring sufficient scrutiny to the executive board. So executive directors are those who act within the organisation on a day-to-day basis. They work in the organisation. Non-executive directors are independent people who are brought in to sit on the board and give independent advice. 2 of them on a 10-man board is not enough. So some corporate governance required half of the board to be large companies to be non-executive directors. Roche would clearly be in breach of that sort of a requirement. They have only 2. Some corporate governance codes, such as the UK code, specify that non-executive directors should not have worked for the company within the last 5 years. Again, Roche would be in breach of that provision. They wouldn't be sufficiently independent if they'd worked for the company within the last 5 years. There's also a very narrow diversity of backgrounds among board members. Diversity can be increased, and that may well increase conflict, but it's generally assumed that it will also stimulate discussion and debate that is often helpful. There's also a somewhat entrenched executive board, and Mary is the first new appointment to the board in many years. So this board, the executive members, have been around for many years. Whilst experience is very important on a board, the appointment of new members can bring fresh ideas and helpful scrutiny of existing policies. Remember, we're looking for that independent view. There's also no discussion of strategy, and there's evidence of a lack of preparation of strategic notes to the board. Most corporate governance codes place the discussion and setting of strategy as a high priority for boards, and Roche would be in breach of such a provision. So corporate governance codes go as far as saying that directors must consider strategy whenever they're in their board meetings. There's also no evidence of training for Mary to facilitate her introduction to the organisation and to introduce her to the systems. Thorough training of new members and ongoing professional development of existing members is an important component of good governance, and that's something that's severely lacking here. So, as I said, that's an introduction to some of the areas that we'll be looking at when it comes to corporate governance. Now that we understand the agency relationship and we've got an idea of the corporate governance requirements that we're going to see throughout the next few lectures, I just want to mention transactional cost theory. So this is an alternative to agency theory. And rather than focusing primarily on the relationship between the agent and the principal, what we focus on here are the transaction costs. So that's the costs within an organisation, the costs of doing business. External costs such as finding suppliers, purchasing costs, those monitoring costs of the management, well, those need to be reduced. And we can reduce those by organising, i.e. we can reduce them by having corporate governance codes. If the costs are too high, we may well internalise those costs, so we could bring those internal to the organisation. So by focusing on those transaction costs, by reducing them by having good corporate governance, that seeks to reduce the cost to the shareholders. Also, don't forget that we have to think about the stakeholders. We have to have accountability to those stakeholders. And again, we'll look at stakeholders in detail over the next few lectures. These should be considered by the agents within the organisation. And agency theory is part of that. There's an agency relationship between the stakeholders and the management within the business as well. There needs to be accountability of the management to the stakeholders. They must be considered in decisions that are made. So that is our agency and transactional theory. We're then going to move on to look in detail at corporate governance codes.